Okay.
All right. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our session. This session follows the plenary of this morning. We had from the ESIR group on how to protect, prepare, and transform Europe in the context of this pandemic. And we follow up with 3 special sessions, one focusing on universities, one focusing on cities and regions, and this session where we're going to focus on the impact of COVID on the global value chains. And I am extremely happy to welcome 4 very distinguished speakers that are joining us from the different corners of the world. We have Jennifer there, who is a professor and chair, recently chair of the Department of Sociology at the University of Virginia. Welcome, Jennifer. We do have, we're very lucky to also have Uma Rani Amara, connecting from Lausanne, Switzerland, who is the senior development economist at the International Labour Organization. We also have Mark Niklas, who is the head of unit industrial strategy and value chains at DG Grow, connecting from Brussels. And very soon, Eric Berloff, who is connecting from Beijing, and who is the chief economist at the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank and also director of the LSE Institute of Global Affairs. So I was not lying to you, 4 very distinguished speakers who are really experts on the topic of value chain and will enlighten us on the impact of this crisis. Of course, we're going to talk about a set of issues in this session, trying to understand a little bit better the overall impact of this crisis, but to try to unpack a little bit different impacts depending on the part of the world where we are located, because we know that there is a lot of asymmetry here in terms of impact of this COVID. We're also going to try to think about forecasting and whether to see whether the things are going to be going back to normal, or if the world has changed. We've seen a major shift in value chain, and things will not be going back to normal. Maybe try to understand a little bit better also if this crisis will accelerate some transition that will, in some extent, create also room for new opportunities to maybe also do things a little bit better. And one question that we've been exploring quite a lot in the ESIR group is related to the concept of resilience of this value chain. And the idea that economists over the past 30, 40 years have been absolutely concerned and very, very excited about the notion of efficiency, which also translates in the way we organize our value chain, sometimes maybe at the expense of resilience. Sometimes there is this joke around that if you would ask an economist to design a human body, you probably will not have 2 kidneys and 2 arms, but only one of each, because it's not efficient. It costs money, and it doesn't serve any purpose. But of course, in a context where you have this kind of shocks, this kind of risk that are also increasing in the context of globalization and hyperconnectivity, we have a little bit to rethink this notion of efficiency at all costs, and maybe try to build some robustness that might be seen as an efficiency in the short term, but maybe very, very important for the robustness of our economic systems in the long run. So these are more or less the type of question that we will explore in the session. And there will be 2 parts in this session. The first one, we will listen to some short response to our panel members to some key questions that we have. And then we will open the floor to discussion from the audience. And for that, I will please invite you to use the chat. And we will basically make sure that we monitor this chat and select the question for our talk. So you're not here to listen to me. You're here to listen to our experts. So I would like to start this conversation by inviting Jennifer to maybe enlighten us a little bit on what would be the long-lasting impact of this pandemic, of this unprecedented pandemic on the value chains, on the global value chains, and especially if developing countries might face the risk of being excluded from these new forms of global value chains. So, Jennifer, please, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in this important conversation. I think that it's a very difficult question to answer, the long-term impact of COVID on global value chains, for two reasons. First, because we're still in the midst of the pandemic, so it's early to make predictions. But the second reason that it's a hard question to answer has less to do with COVID-19 and more to do with global value chains generally, which is that they're incredibly heterogeneous. So the global value chains for, let's say, automobiles, clothing, and electronics vary a great deal, to say nothing of those for agro-food, pharmaceuticals, or services like tourism. So that means that there won't be one impact of COVID on global value chains. There'll be many, and they'll likely differ both within and certainly across industries and sectors. Now, already we know that some sectors have been more affected by others. Agro-food, for example, has arguably fared better than some other industries, both because food is an essential commodity and because these chains tend to be shorter than chains for manufactured goods. If we consider, for example, the textile and garment industry, which employs about 60 million people worldwide, the majority women, the impacts have really been quite devastating, not just because garments, at least of the non-PPE kind, right, are non-essential, but also because many garment factories in countries like Bangladesh or Ethiopia or Vietnam rely on imported fabric from China. So even before these manufacturers were hit by plummeting demand in importing markets, clothing factories were affected by a break in the supply chain that prevented shipments of their main input, textiles, largely from China. But to the degree that one can generalize in response to this question, I think that one thing we can definitely say that we've learned is how fragile global value chains are. There were previous indications of this, like disruptions to supply chains that occurred in the aftermath of mostly natural disasters, or dramatic events like the 2011 Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan. But I think the scope and the scale of the supply chain disruptions caused by COVID-19 have been on a different order of magnitude. And the effects ripple, as the example of the apparel industry that I mentioned suggests, because although the epidemic hits different regions at different times, delays have cascading effects down the supply chain, especially when those breakpoints are occurring sort of at the beginning of the chain. But I want to emphasize what I think is a really important point, which is that global value chain growth has been more or less stagnant since the 2008 financial crisis. So I think that looking back, we may see that the 1990s were really sort of the heyday for truly global value chains. Overall, trade has bounced back since the financial crisis, but trade in intermediate goods, so the kinds of parts and components that are really critical for global value chains, has actually not returned to the levels that were reached prior to 2008. More recently, of course, we've seen a wave of economic nationalism, and that's further contributed to a slowdown in GVC growth. But again, that wave of protectionism sort of started in a context of already slowed global value chain growth. So I think the real effect of COVID-19 may be an acceleration of changes that were already underway. That's almost certainly the case, I think, when we think about advances in digital technologies and information communication technologies more generally that have really been stimulated by the pandemic. And one such change is the increased sophistication of automation, and in particular, automated manufacturing. Now, again, this was a trend that was already well underway before the pandemic. But to the extent that advances in automation extend further into sectors like light manufacturing, I think that's really likely to increase the pace of reshoring. That might mean, for example, if we think about developing countries, that China's experience of jump-starting sustained growth via an extended period of specialization in labor-intensive manufacturing, essentially the kind of world factory model, that just may not be available to other developing countries. Now, automation, of course, has long been expected to lead to more reshoring. But I want to end by noting that some of what we may think of as reshoring to high-wage countries might really be nearshoring. In other words, American companies might be shifting production out, or sourcing for that matter, out of, say, East Asia or South Asia. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's going back to the United States, right? It may be shifting to Mexico. So reshoring may reinforce a process of regionalization. We may be moving from a world of global value chains to a world of more regional value chains. right, where value chains are consolidated within macro regions centered on large markets. So North America, Greater Europe, East Asia. This could be bad news for developing countries that aren't geographically proximate to these regions, particularly if they aren't participating in preferential trade agreements that might give them market access. Although it's also possible that growth in South-South trade could create some new opportunities for developing countries that would offset the negative effects of such a trend. So I think to conclude, I wouldn't necessarily say that we know that developing countries are going to be excluded from GVCs, but we know that even prior to COVID-19, participation in global value chains was already very uneven across the developing world. And I think that the post-pandemic restructuring of supply chains may well exacerbate that unevenness.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's fascinating, and I also appreciate that you mentioned this heterogeneity also in this value chain, that we cannot just offer a generalized response. Like, we have to actually dig into the specificity of them, but also some macro facts like this impact of automation and the fact that we also a new geography of this value chain with a kind of macro regionalization, I think is extremely helpful and allows us to understand a little bit better how this complex system kind of unfolds and try to reorganize itself. It might be also bad news for some part of the world that might be indeed excluded from geography, but maybe also a form of hope when it connects to climate change, right? Because we might have this value chain reorganizing themselves in a much shorter way, in a sense, and might also help us to think about the value chain of the future in a greener way, which is good news to some extent. So thank you. I do have a lot of follow-up questions because it's really a lot of issues that you mentioned in this response, and we will come back to some of this question hopefully in a few minutes. But so you were mentioning, of course, this impact of this COVID-19, especially on some developing countries that might be a little bit more affected depending on where they are in terms of geography. And which leads me a little bit to ask Uma to enter this conversation and maybe focus a little bit more on the impact of COVID-19 on the digital labor platform, which is very much your topic of expertise, and both in the EU and more developing countries. So would you be so kind to let us know what your take is on this very, very critical issue?
Thanks, Pierre, and it's a nice opportunity to actually engage in a conversation. And I enjoyed Jennifer's interaction about this entire global supply chains and the heterogeneity, which I have to say is the same when it comes to the digital labor platforms, because they're not one unique. And I think if one would want to expand a bit more beyond digital labor platforms and talk of digital platforms, then you can see that the impacts are very different. You can talk about e-commerce platforms, which have gained quite a bit as a result of COVID pandemic. But on the other hand, when you look at digital labor platforms per se, you have location-based platforms like the transportation and delivery, where the workers became that of the essential services. So one has a notion that, well, there have been a lot of opportunities there for the workers, but it is not very clear whether these opportunities have been there for them, because many of the workers, because of the lockdown situations, could not actually access work. Because we've tried doing some work in developing countries, and based on our own survey, we tried touching just a 10% of the sample to understand whether they could go back to work or not. And only about 4% of them could get any jobs. So, this notion that exists, that there's a lot of these opportunities that are there, that needs to be looked at a bit carefully. But I think what it throws open, especially the location-based delivery platforms, I think this is where the entire exposure of risks and vulnerabilities that many of these workers face, not only while working, but also not having work. And I think this pandemic has actually exposed that vulnerability and actually talks not just about the fragility of the global supply chains, but also talks about the fragility of the digital labor platforms that we have. The fact that there's no protection for the workers in any way, whether it is income supplementation, social protection, or, how do they manage their risks and vulnerabilities that they face. as a result of it. I think that exposure has come out very clearly. And this is equal, whether you're talking about Europe, US, or the developing countries. I think workers all over have experienced that. But what's quite interesting to observe has been what's been happening on the online web-based platforms. We've been working with the Oxford Internet Institute, which has been tracking workers on 5 major English-speaking platforms, and we've further extended to look at another 7 from the developing countries. And it was fascinating to see, as soon as the pandemic hit in March, actually the demand for work reduced drastically world over. And then it started picking up in mid-April, and it went on increasing some point till July. And I think July, August are generally the summer months. The seasonality has to be taken into consideration, and it comes down. And now you see that it's picking up, according to the recent data till September 20th that you see. But again here, to understand what is happening and to look at which are the countries that are demanding a lot of work from these platforms, it's been largely many of the developed countries and some of the developing. So in the developed world, what you see is that because of actually not enough revenue coming in, and because of not work, so you have to ration out what you can outsource and what you cannot. So as a result, you find that many of the companies in US and in Europe have actually reduced the demand for work on these platforms. Whereas on the other hand, you have countries like India, which has a major share on these platforms, that has actually increased a lot of work. So what is happening there is you are substituting on-site work with online work. And you saw immediately after the pandemic, you had huge layoffs happening in India. And I can't talk of other countries because other countries do not really come up in the top 10 that we have when we look at it. But I think you can see a bit of this trend happening in many other developing countries too. But you don't see that happening in the developed world, which is very fascinating and interesting to see. On the other hand, if you look at the supply of labor to these platforms, it has enormously increased world over, and much more in the developing countries. And it's not surprising at all. So what's happening is you do not have on-site work. Unemployment has become a big issue. You have major lockdowns happening across many of these countries. So what are people doing? You do not, and one has to understand that these are countries which do not have any sort of a safety net. Even if you are very highly educated and you've had good jobs and you've lost them, you don't have real safety net or unemployment insurance to cover you. So as a result, what is happening is many of these workers are actually getting online, trying to get some jobs. Now, the issue that comes up, now if we are talking about what needs to be done, and if this is to be continued, we do not know when we are going to be out of this COVID-19 pandemic. So if this is to continue, I think one of the things that we really need to think about and talk about is what is the kind of a regulatory mechanism we need to put in place? Because as of now, there's absolutely no regulation, as you know, whether you're talking about transport delivery applications or whether you're talking about online platform-based work. So I think this is something that we need to think about much more carefully, how to go about implementing, given it's a global issue, it's a multilateral issue, how to set up such a regulatory mechanism. So I think I'll stop here for the moment and then come back for the questions.
Thank you, Matu, for giving us this perspective, and I think also highlighting this very high vulnerability of workers, whether we're talking about developing countries or Europe or the US. This vulnerability is something that was there but got exposed even more. This transition, I think this is a point that we really have to take into consideration, at least in Europe, and see how we can deal with that. And also this form of resilience of Indian workers being able to kind of switch and transition from on-site to online kind of work, and I'm assuming also find jobs maybe abroad, jobs that were maybe posted in the US, and be able to connect to these jobs having the language capabilities, the computational abilities as well to kind of switch and be able to be resilient, I think is really fascinating and very important for this conversation, also connecting to resilience. So thank you so much. And again, I have many questions, but we will leave them for later. Which leads us to Mark, who maybe will give us a bit more of a European perspective here, with the very big questions. I do recognize that these questions are not easy to answer today, but they're also very thought-provoking. I mean, they lead us to really brainstorm and try to tackle like also the very big issues. And what I want to ask you, Mark, is to read like. Actually, more concretely, how is Europe taking action to preserve and transform this value chain? And do we see any kind of changes in the EU industrial strategy that will maybe affect the way we organize value chains in the future with this pandemic?
Yeah, thank you, Pierre Alexandre, and good afternoon. Before I go into that question, maybe one comment to follow up on Jennifer's point, because it's very interesting, this link between the international perspective from the previous two speakers and my very European perspective. And this point about the global value chains versus the regionalization of value chains. What we see actually in the EU is that the European industry is much stronger integrated in pan-European value chains than is the case in North America. And at the same time, those companies very integrated in the pan-European value chains are also active in the global value chains. So this is, I think, an interesting finding that we had. Now, coming to the transformation of the industrial value chains in Europe, and of course, there is the twin transformation going on. On the one hand, the green transformation towards a climate neutral, towards a circular economy, and at the same time the digital transformation, as was already mentioned, towards a more data-driven economy. And these transformation processes happen at the same time as changes in the global competitive landscape. And this combination, of course, is a challenge for the industry, but it can also provide new opportunities. And I think the role of the industrial policy is to enable this transformation process to turn into an opportunity, which means accelerating this green and digital transformation of the value chains as a new source of growth and prosperity, which I guess has two main instruments that we actually can provide. Clearly, it requires support for research and innovation in the breakthrough technologies for this green and digital transformation. And at the same time, we need to provide an enabling framework, starting from the regulatory framework up to the skills that are needed for this green and digital transformation. So let me give you maybe two examples of how value chains are transformed with the green transition and how we support that. The first is looking at sustainable mobility. There, the value chain for electric mobility is clearly different from the traditional automotive value chain. And a lot of value actually is within the batteries, where Europe did not have any substantial presence in that part of the value chain. So that's why then the European industrial policy and cooperation between the European Commission and the member states led them to a strong investment in the battery value chain, I would say, in Europe. Because there again, you need the value chain perspective, starting from the materials that you need for the batteries until the end of life, the recycling of the batteries. And this then really creates new value chains. So it's about transforming industrial value chains. It's also about creating new value chains. And another example that I would like to give you was just mentioned last week by our president as one of the flagship projects for the recovery, it's clean hydrogen. And there again, it's about the transformation of the chemical production of hydrogen from fossil hydrogen to renewable hydrogen. Once you have that green hydrogen, it can help to transform many other value chains, like producing steel with hydrogen instead of fossil fuels, using the renewable hydrogen for heavy mobility, trucks, or as synthetic fuels then in the future for shipping and aviation. So it is really a massive transformation of value chains that takes place, and that then we from the policy side need to stimulate, as I said, with support to the research, the technology side, and also to enable the transition, create lead markets for such products, which might be not cost competitive at the beginning, but will become quickly cost competitive if you can scale them up. And then in addition to these transformations driven by the green and the digital transformation, which has been there, but I think they have been accelerated with the COVID-19 crisis, and therefore also they have been pillars of our industrial strategy already since 3 years at least. But I think the message becomes stronger and stronger that we need to drive this transformation process. Another element is then that we also need to avoid critical dependencies within the value chains. And there, in the COVID-19 crisis, has clearly shown our European vulnerability in the health area, as the active pharmaceutical ingredients are produced elsewhere. And then if supply is cut, you can't produce any pharmaceuticals anymore. Similar, it's about raw materials, where then also just very recently we actually presented an action plan for raw materials to increase this resilience, which we have discussed, which has then, and as we proposed in raw materials, there are different measures, different ways how to improve the resilience. It can be diversification of supply, so that you don't depend on one single supplier in one given country. It can mean increasing the supply domestically. And it could also mean using more circularity, so that you can have the supply of the secondary raw materials as a substitute for the very scarce raw materials. Again, and this comes back to the discussion resilience versus efficiency. Again, I think the industry, it's nothing new, but the importance of this resilience aspect clearly has been accelerated and is much clearer for everybody where to make this choice between efficiency and resilience. So it's both something that you see on the individual company level, and they need to take care of their resilience, and on the more macroeconomic level for the whole European industry. To finish, maybe I would like to make a link to the title of this session, because we've talked a lot about the impact, and the title is actually something on protecting and preparing and transforming. My focus is, as you've heard, on the transforming, but at the same time we need also more anticipation so that we are prepared in times of crisis and are able to react before it's too late. And of course, also the transformation always, it will not have an equal impact on all the industries and on all the workers and employees. So there is also this complementarity with a certain degree of protection to make the transformation successful.
Thank you so much, Mark, for this very comprehensive answer, really dealing with key issues of critical dependencies, resilience. Also, I would say kind of a positive message on the idea that we're facing challenges, but this also maybe stepping stones to seek new opportunities and do things also differently, accelerating the green transition and the digital transition. So there were a lot of very, very insightful ideas that can be unpacked in your answer. So thank you so much. And I see that Eric joined us and is connecting from Beijing. So thank you so much, Eric, for being with us in this session. I would like to maybe ask you the question on a bit more like focusing on infrastructure, which is also related to the new position that you took at the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. On what are the main implications, according to you, for infrastructure of this COVID-19 crisis, and how can we compare a little bit the reactions to the pandemics from an Asian perspective and a European perspective?
Can you hear me, actually?
We can hear you, yes, very well.
Okay, good, because I get all this message. First of all, someone sent me the wrong link, but here we are. And anyhow, so thank you. And I have only been able to hear bits and pieces of what seemed to be a very interesting panel. So my comments were actually probably better suited at an earlier stage in this discussion, but let me nevertheless make them. So I think I'll come to infrastructure in just a second, but I think to me it's very important when we talk about these global value chains is how that they are really embedded in so many ways. I mean, they are embedded in terms of they're very deeply embedded in growth strategies, and some of the examples that were given before, how they on the one hand offer opportunities to countries to enter into these value chains, but also now because of the very fundamental structural changes that have happened, it also precludes some growth strategies and or maybe derails some growth strategies for individual countries. And of course, they're also very much reflecting and embedded in technological shifts. So when you see now things going on in terms of the shift from goods and services to information, that affects how these value chains operate, of course, and this increasing fragmentation that we have seen over a long period of time has, on the one hand, opened up opportunities for countries to come in, even with very small parts of these value chains. But it also makes there's also vulnerabilities that are coming from new technologies. AI may replace some of the important opportunities for call centers, for example. I mean, there are many things. Robotization, we know, may lead to sort of onshoring and so on. So they're embedded in technological sense. But I think what I really wanted to emphasize is also that they're very much embedded politically, and that in the sense that we see, a lot of the kind of inequalities that are emerging, not so much because, but sometimes because of the global value chains, but they often, some of the reactions against these inequalities are directed at these global value chains. And you see also here in Asia, a number of reactions against it. But maybe most fundamentally, of course, they're very vulnerable to geopolitics. And I think that's where I think the absolute main threat to these value chains are now, that we are actually, you said, I'm actually not in Beijing, I'm in Shanghai in quarantine on my way to Beijing. And I certainly look forward to learning much more about how this works in Asia and how these developments in geopolitics will affect these global value chains. But I think it's very important to have all those aspects when we talk about global value chains. And of course, these increased global tensions, these increased inequalities, technological shifts, all those things are really making it much more difficult to kind of forecast how these value chains will evolve. And of course, as was mentioned, of course, earlier, is that if you look at under the surface of all these sort of stagnating share of global value chains, it's been a massive transformation, and that's very much all about China. Essentially, it's about China, taking more and more of intermediate goods and producing it in China. And of course, now there is this theory that we still have to understand a bit what they really mean, but they talk about this dual circulation, and that you have sort of a separate economy for the domestic economy, and then you have something that is where China interacts with the rest of the world. But I think when it comes to infrastructure, the infrastructure in China has been a very important part of China's ability to take so much of the global value chain. So it's hard to say what the causality is, because of course some of the infrastructure has responded to this, but it is absolutely essential. And actually I landed in the middle of this, but the AIB is going to have its next flagship report exactly on this issue of what will be the impact of COVID and also these geopolitical tensions that I mentioned on the global value chains and on the role of infrastructure in this. So if you come to me in 6 months, I will know a lot more about this. But I think it's important to situate these global value chains in a much larger context, because for many countries this is a lifeline, and it's something that has been extremely positive for many countries. But now, because of these disruptions that we are seeing, it's not so clear how it's going to play out for many of these countries. Sorry, I got a bit lengthy there, but hopefully I didn't duplicate too much of what the rest of you said.
No, absolutely not. Actually, it complements our discussion really, really beautifully. So we do have some time for questions now, and maybe I will start with a question that seems very critical. Like all of you, all different speakers, really focused on the question of fragility, resilience, vulnerability at different level. And if maybe Eric, because something that you mentioned a bit less, but have you seen maybe a response, or do you know about a response in Asia that's a bit different from the response we had in Europe or in the US, that is a bit more like anti-fragile, like out of, and of course this is also a question for the speakers, but like that also connects to what Eric was saying. Do you see also a different response that might also help us to understand if there are some better approaches to this organizational value chain that might make them a little bit more robust and prepare for another form of disruption that might happen later?
Well, I think it's very early to say something about this. I mean, it is because we don't have really good data. But if you look at some of the high frequency data, certainly here in China, it seems like these global value chains are coming back with a vengeance, and they have been very quick at reestablishing this. They're very resilient. They're also doing quite well in terms of exports. If you look at the trade between China and here again looking at some sort of high frequency data on transportation and so on, the pattern is that possibly with the exception of the US, we are coming back to the old flows. So maybe this disruption, the sort of COVID-related disruption, may be, at least in the short term, not as large as we thought. Obviously, it was large in the immediate reaction, but in terms of what you are looking for, the kind of building up, shifting to having multiple suppliers or multiple parallel chains or building up greater buffers in these, the cost pressures on these global value chains are enormous. I mean, the rest of the people on the panel here knows more about that, but I really think that this is something we have to wait for the data, I think, because I think there are definitely, you hear a lot of companies talking about, we're going to be much more careful about how dependent we become on China as a supplier. We want to have dual sourcing and so on. But, the margins in these value chains are very small and very narrow and very subtle. Even very small increases in costs can completely shift you out of the value chain. So yes, I think there will be changes, but I think we still have to wait for the data to say whether they will be as fundamental as maybe some of the statements we have seen suggest.
Wonderful. Thank you. Another question is related to the issue of inequality. And again, all of you have mentioned some differential impact in different part of the world, but also for workers. So companies are affected in a different way than workers are. So some companies show some kind of very strong anti-fragility, but workers are actually, the part of the chain that is very vulnerable, and that makes maybe the overall chain resilient, but then the workers are themselves vulnerable or have a lot of pressure with that, as we're seeing in the case of UMA. So let's think about this notion of inequality, especially with the transition, the digital transition. Okay, so like this COVID-19, as we're experiencing now, we have this session online. We've seen a major shift in digital transition, and we know that the digital economy is, by definition, a winner-takes-all kind of game, right? So we've seen again these tech companies, these digital labor platforms, maybe gaining out of this COVID-19, but the workers themselves actually not gaining at all. And we see this kind of inequality kind of building up. So how can we? And it's a question that's open to all of you, because you all kind of touch upon different topics on this related to this question. But how can we imagine a world? And from a EU perspective, like what kind of actions can we take to lead a digital transition that is fair and that is oriented to the people, and that is something that won't, increase tremendously the inequality that we already observe in the system? That's a very big question, I'm aware. And it's an open question, so who wants to go first can take the floor. Yes, Uma, please.
Yeah, my mic is sorry. I think that's a very, very big question, and it touches upon a number of issues, but I'm not going to go into the detail of all of them, but just touch upon a few aspects which I think is very important for us in this discussion. And given that we have Eric, who's also part of the infrastructure AIB now, I think it's very clear that this pandemic will further exacerbate and increase inequalities. There's absolutely no doubt about it. And that the fact that you see resilience is among the middle or the top part of the income. It's not really the resilience that is there at the bottom end. It's actually probably resilient. One of the reasons why you don't see any sort of a strike or any sort of a movement today is because they're still depending upon their savings. And once the savings are completely out, that's when, there are going to be further protests, movements, or, social movements that should be coming out if governments are not going to do anything about it. Because as of now, I don't think there's enough that has been done in any of the countries with regard to addressing what needs to be done for workers. And I think if you look at Asia and Africa, these are regions that I know much better than in Latin America, where you have a large proportion of workers in the informal economy. And many of these informal economy workers have not been able to get out and get the jobs, actually. Not only are they part of the global supply chains, but they're also part of domestic supply chains and domestic street vending, or being just domestic workers. They have not really got their jobs back. And that's the vulnerability and the risk that they face, where their incomes are going to go down to further than -0, because they are going to live on loans or borrowed money, which they have to repay. So, the inequality that we're going to see is far more than what is there. So I think for me, that worries me quite a bit. As you know, what are the steps that we need to take with regard to addressing the work incomes for these households? The second issue, coming to the digital platform, the resilience is probably there among those where you have very good access to internet and where you have very good digital infrastructure. Given that, a lot of places are under lockdown and a lot of work has gone into remote working, there's a huge pressure on digital infrastructure. So this is further going to lead to a digital divide across countries, because you have countries like probably India, which has pretty good digital infrastructure. But if you ask an Indian there, they would say it's not as good as what you have in Europe, which is very true, but at least you have it. And you have a whole lot of countries in Asia and Africa where digital infrastructure is pretty weak and poor. And how is it that we are going to reach out to giving access to work for many of the people? This whole assumption that is sometimes there that, well, there are these digital online platforms and they're going to give the jobs to many of them. That's not really true. I did talk about in the first round the supply of work is increasing. What I didn't tell in that round is the fact that the supply is increasing, but the jobs are not there for you to do. So, for probably 1,000 workers or even 10,000 workers, there are probably 10 workers or 3 workers or 5 workers who get a job. So, you have huge competition and you're further racing down to the bottom with regard to the wages on many of these platforms. So this is something we have been monitoring and we have been consequently doing. So I think it's not a very optimistic scenario I give you a very pessimistic scenario, but actually it's much more worrying what is happening, and there's going to be further rise in inequality. What needs to be done, and I'll stop it there, I think at least as far as the digital labor platforms is concerned, we very clearly need, it's high time. Like you said, winners take all. It's high time winners don't take all. And this is something that we have seen during this crisis, that commission rates, especially for delivery and transportation, have gone up, whether it is the restaurants paying or the grocery stores paying or the workers paying. And where is all this commission going to? It's going into the hands of the company. Again, on e-commerce platforms, you saw how much of profits that were being made as a result of people actually directly accessing from these platforms. So I think we need to put regulation in place. We need to have a governance structure. And I think it's high time, probably this is not just EU related, because digital labor platforms are much more global. You can't really regionalize it. You can regionalize or nationalize to the extent that it is a location-based platform. So I think it's important to think about a global regulatory mechanism that could be put in place and a governance structure which looks into it. And here, a multilateral system is what we need to put that in place. So I'll stop
there. Thank you so much, Anna. Jennifer, I think you wanted to complement, please.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something quickly, which is that, and it goes back, I think, to one of the main points that I tried to make in my comments, which is that we have to be careful not to attribute to COVID-19 trends that were already actually underway prior to COVID-19. And I think that there was already a debate prior to the pandemic that was really raising the question about the degree to which the rise in global value chains had contributed to the decline in the labor share of income. For sort of the reasons that that Eric mentioned in terms of the incredible kind of cost competitiveness and the price pressure in many of these global value chains. And originally, I think the narrative around global value chains, which to some degree was absolutely true, was that they were creating essentially kind of an opportunity structure for developing countries to integrate into the global economy in a variety of ways, and that they could then kind of upgrade in the global value chain. And that this would have a positive impact on growth and development. At the same time, though, I think recently there's really been a lot of concern about the relationship between global value chains and inequality. And I think that Uma's point is really important, which is that there's this acute crisis that we are now seeing in terms of COVID, which is causing us to ask all these questions about the precarity of workers. At the same time, that crisis is playing out against a backdrop of what was already a relatively worrisome trend in terms of rising inequality. So, I can't say that I'm much more optimistic than Uma is, but certainly there is a challenge in front of us in trying to figure out if this pandemic does create new opportunities to perhaps reverse some of the worrying trends that were already underway before COVID hit.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for this additional insight. And unfortunately, we do have to close the session. We're a little bit past time. But I'd like to really thank you for this really incredible comments, and also let you know that This is not just a one-off event where we have you giving your opinion on these important topics and just closing the door. We will actually integrate your comments. We are recording this session, and we integrate your comments in the next work of the expert group of ESIR, and we will have follow-ups. This is the goal is to keep the discussion going and also like implement some action as much as possible. But I really would like to thank you again for taking the time to participate to this conversation. And yes, I'm really happy. I really enjoyed the way it went, and I hope I wish you well. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.